Hey guys, tonight we trudge quietly into the daily life of a World War II soldier, not through battles or strategies, but through something far more immediate: the food. Imagine this. You're crouched behind a half-collapsed wall in northern France. It's raining in that way that soaks even your thoughts. And from the pocket of your pack, you pull out a small, battered tin labeled meat canned. You pop it open with a rusty key and sniff cautiously. Yep, still smells like despair. But hey, it's dinner. You're not alone. Millions of soldiers from the Allied and Axis powers subsisted on this type of sustenance, mass-produced, standardized, and almost universally uninspiring. Combat rations weren't designed for pleasure. They were built for survival, portability, and shelf life longer than most marriages. And tonight, we're diving into every spoonful. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're awake enough, drop your location and what time you're listening in the comments. I'd love to know where in the world you're drifting off tonight. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your hands are grimy from digging into muddy earth, and your breath fogs faintly in the evening chill. The tin is cold, the contents gelatinous. You slide out a pale slab of something between meatloaf and industrial paste, technically pork, or at least that's what the label optimistically claims. This is a Type C ration, the mainstay of American infantry, especially when hot meals from a field kitchen are a distant dream. Each C ration meal came with an M unit, that's the meat, and a B unit, which, disappointingly, stood for bread and not something more exciting like bourbon. You tear into hard biscuits designed to survive a nuclear winter, and chase it with instant coffee powder stirred into tepid water, gritty and bitter enough to make your eyes twitch. It's not gourmet, but at least it's calories. Historians still argue whether these meals did more harm than good to morale, but one thing's certain: nobody forgot the taste. Meanwhile, across the field, British troops might be eating something equally bleak. The British 24-hour ration pack included biscuits, tea, sugar, canned meat or cheese, and, if the supply gods were smiling, some jam. The British Army loved their tea with an almost religious fervor. Even on the move, soldiers would scrounge bits of wood to boil water, sometimes using petrol for an extra kick and lung damage. And yes, the Germans were no exception to culinary compromise. The Wehrmacht issued Erbswurst, a dried pea sausage, which sounds better in theory than it smelled after boiling in a dented tin cup. It was dense, salty, and reportedly made you question your life choices. German soldiers also carried iron rations, high-calorie emergency packs that included a slab of preserved meat, hard bread, and a bitter chocolate bar fortified with caffeine. It was enough to keep you moving, barely. Quirkier still was the Japanese Senchi Ryo, or combat ration. It included dried rice, pickled plums, and sometimes fish or vegetables. However, the packaging often failed in humid conditions, and soldiers resorted to wrapping rations in waxed paper or even banana leaves. Nutritional deficiencies were common, especially vitamin B1, leading to beriberi, a cruel ailment when you're already battling the jungle, bullets, and existential dread. Imagine now a soldier in the Pacific Theater peeling open a box under a mosquito net, rice stuck together like wet newspaper, with a side of dried seaweed. A few ants scurry out. Free protein bonus. You sigh, take a bite, and remind yourself, at least it's not your turn. On watch. And here's a funny little twist. Americans were obsessed with Spam, not just as a meat product, but as a concept. Hormel's pink miracle was shipped by the millions, forming a key protein source for not only U.S. troops, but also Allied forces and even civilians in bombed-out cities. Stalin's Russia, in a rare moment of gratitude, praised American Spam for helping feed Red Army troops. It might have been the only time the Soviets smiled about processed meat. Field food wasn't just a matter of supply. It shaped strategy. Troops couldn't advance without calories. Logistics officers calculated daily caloric intake per soldier with the precision of mathematicians, weighing how much could be airdropped, how long it would last, and how many would vomit after eating it. The worst part? The monotony. Day after day of the same salty, meaty, mushy textures. Soldiers would trade, hoard, or outright gamble with their rations. A chocolate bar could buy you a favor. A tin of peaches? Practically a luxury yacht in food currency. And remember, you're lugging all this on your back. The average combat load was over 60 pounds. Rifle, ammo, helmet, water, shovel, and yes, several pounds of dull, dense food. You eat fast, shovel style, crouched behind cover. No table, no utensils, unless you've whittled something from a stick, and no second helpings. Despite the grimness, there's a weird comfort in it. The food becomes a ritual. You know what to expect, and in a world of chaos, that matters. You bite into another cracker, taste the metallic tang of canned beans, and almost smile. Almost. You wake up to the gentle drumming of rain on canvas and the not-so-gentle growl of your stomach. Morning, if you can call it that, arrives not with sunlight but with the scent of damp uniforms and the unmistakable funk of men who've gone days without a proper wash. Somewhere in the distance, artillery mumbles like a bad dream trying to start over. You reach for your morning meal with all the enthusiasm of someone grabbing a sock from a puddle. Breakfast in the trenches, or foxholes, bombed-out barns, jungle clearings, or snow-laced hillsides, was rarely something to look forward to. Depending on where you're stationed, you're either boiling your tea over a miniature stove made from a sardine tin or gnawing a ration bar that's so dry it threatens to sue your molars for abuse. But hey, it's the most important meal of the day, right? For American soldiers, the morning usually started with the B unit of the C ration: dry biscuits, powdered beverage mix, either coffee, or if fate had truly turned against you, lemon juice powder, and a chunk of cheese or peanut butter that required a bayonet to open and several prayers to digest. If you were on a base with access to a field kitchen, things might be better. Scrambled powdered eggs, yes, that's a thing, reconstituted with milk substitute and served in a pool of lukewarm grease. Historians still argue whether this dish should count as food or performance art. British forces clung to their morning ritual with pride. Tea came first, always. Even under fire, soldiers boiled water in mess tins or old cans. It wasn't just for caffeine. It was a moment of normalcy, of Britishness, a thread tying them back to home. Alongside came hardtack biscuits, a piece of bacon, more fat than meat, and perhaps a dab of jam. The joke was that British breakfast was less about nutrition and more about stubborn tradition. Now you're picturing a trench in France, 1944. A Tommy sits on an overturned helmet, sipping weak tea out of a tin mug, pinky finger raised in exaggerated elegance. He offers you a biscuit, you bite, and immediately regret everything. It's dry, it's tasteless, it's hard enough to be used in hand-to-hand combat. German soldiers didn't fare much better. Their breakfasts might consist of dark rye bread, if available, a slice of sausage, and ersatz coffee, substitute coffee made from roasted barley, chicory, or acorns. The Germans called it muckafuck. And no, it's not swearing, just a rough translation of fake coffee. Surprisingly, it was sometimes preferred to real coffee for its rich, earthy taste. Or maybe that was just hunger lying to you. Quirky breakfast items were surprisingly common. Italian troops sometimes had polenta cakes made in advance and wrapped in cloth, which were as bland as they were filling. Soviet soldiers, when they weren't surviving on black bread and lard, were known to eat cold kasha, buckwheat porridge, directly out of their helmets. Kasha, when made well, is nutty and comforting. In a trench, it tastes like regret with a hint of metal. Open scholarly debate still surrounds the nutritional effectiveness of these breakfasts. Were soldiers really getting the energy they needed to march, dig, shoot, and survive? Or were they simply enduring on fumes, caffeine, and pure stubbornness? Modern analysis suggests many rations were high in calories but low in vitamins, leading to everything from fatigue to scurvy in long deployments. And then there's the logistics of making breakfast. Picture this. You huddle behind a shattered wall, balancing a cup of water over a tiny flame, shielding it from the wind with your helmet. You're hoping the fire catches enough to warm the tin of eggs you've nested precariously beside it. Meanwhile, a buddy's shouting about how his spoon melted into his porridge. Again, you might laugh, but improvisation became a culinary skill. Soldiers used mess kits like Swiss Army knives, part pot, part plate, part self-defense weapon. They learned to soak biscuits overnight to make them chewable or mix cocoa powder with leftover fat to create trench fudge. Field stoves, like the British No. 2 and German Esbit, were small metal contraptions designed for simplicity, but prone to tipping over at the worst possible moments, like right before your only warm meal of the day. Of course, not all breakfasts were bad. Sometimes there were moments of quiet luxury. A Red Cross package might include real coffee. A local farmer might sneak you a few eggs. You might swap a pack of cigarettes for a crusty piece of bread still warm from an underground oven. These tiny joys, these edible miracles, were talked about for weeks. You could measure morale in spoonfuls of jam as you chew another mouthful of dense biscuit, so dry you feel like it's absorbing your will to live. You look at your comrades. They're laughing at a joke someone made about powdered eggs being a German plot. You snort into your tea. It's bitter, too strong, and absolutely perfect. Because in the end, breakfast wasn't just food, it was a brief return to order. It was a pocket of normality tucked between chaos. Even if all you had was a square of Spam and a lukewarm mug of artificial coffee, you still clung to that ritual. Because survival isn't just physical, it's psychological. And sometimes, survival starts with breakfast. You're crouched beside a truck that smells faintly of oil and old socks, balancing a pink slab of meat product on your mess tin. It jiggles slightly. You poke it with your fork. It jiggles again. Yes, it's Spam. The gelatinous, glistening, glorious centerpiece of your impromptu battlefield brunch. And believe it or not, you're one of millions eating the exact same thing today. Spam wasn't just a food. It was a cultural phenomenon, a protein-packed punchline, and quite possibly the most beloved and begrudged meat in military history. Created by Hormel Foods in 1937, this peculiar potted pork took on new life during World War II, when its long shelf life and compact size made it perfect for shipping across oceans and into war zones. Historians still argue whether Spam helped win the war or just made everyone slightly saltier. You peel back the tin with effort, no easy open tabs here, and reveal a faintly pink, compacted rectangle of pork, shoulder and ham, held together by salt, sugar, and the tenacity of industrial food science. It has a jelly coating that shimmers under the light. You scoop out a piece. It slides off the spoon with a sound best described as moist thud. You sigh, you chew, you swallow. Somehow you don't hate it. And honestly, many soldiers didn't. Spam was predictable. It didn't spoil. It tasted the same whether you fried it, baked it, or simply hacked off a cold chunk and ate it with your fingers. It wasn't glamorous, but it was dependable. For troops living day to day, dodging bullets and disease, that kind of culinary consistency was a weird kind of comfort. Americans loved Spam so much, they sent over 150 million pounds of it overseas during World War II. It filled mess halls, field packs, and even diplomatic care packages. Soviet soldiers received it via the Lend-Lease program. British civilians found it a miracle food amid rationing. And in the Pacific, Spam became so prevalent that many island nations adopted it into their local cuisines, where it still thrives today. Try Spam musubi in Hawaii, or Spam stew in the Philippines. But not everyone was thrilled. U.S. soldiers often joked about the various Spam-based meals they were subjected to. Spam hash, Spam omelets, Spam sandwiches, Spam surprise, the surprise being that it was still Spam. Some soldiers got so fed up with it they mailed empty tins back to Hormel in protest. One even wrote a poem about the horrors of Spam-induced dreams. It rhymed, but it didn't help. British troops had their own processed meat to wrangle with. While Spam was included in rations, they also received luncheon meat, a close cousin of Spam but with a blander flavor and more questionable texture. It came in cans so sturdy that you could use them as emergency building materials, and sometimes did. German soldiers, on the other hand, relied more on sausages and preserved meats like Dosenwurst, a canned meat sausage that could be sliced, fried, or eaten cold. While less uniform than Spam, it was deeply ingrained in German food culture. Some versions even included blood sausage or liverwurst, which sounds fancy until you're eating it with a bayonet under enemy fire. One fringe, but fascinating fact. Hormel once had to hire a team to read and respond to all the bizarre Spam-related letters coming from soldiers and their families. These included recipes, threats, marriage proposals to the meat, and one request to make a Spam-scented cologne. Hormel politely declined. In the Pacific Theater, Spam was particularly important. It didn't require refrigeration, could be eaten quickly, and was adaptable. Troops stationed on small islands learned to fry it in mess kits, dice it into rice, or mash it with powdered eggs for a breakfast burrito avant la lettre. One soldier reportedly tried to carve a chess set out of hardened Spam. He gave up after the night melted. Spam also had a political life. Churchill grumbled about how reliant Britain had become on American Spam, calling it a wartime necessity and a peacetime horror. Stalin, famously unfond of Western food, allegedly admitted that without Spam, his troops would have been hungrier, maybe slightly angrier, which honestly was terrifying enough. What made Spam particularly resilient was not just the food itself, but the branding. The name Spam is thought to derive from spiced ham, though the exact etymology is still debated. In a rare overlap of wartime history and theater, the name gained immortal status when Monty Python turned it into a running gag in the 1970s, forever linking Spam to repetition and mild existential dread. And yes, that's why your email folder is called Spam today. You glance down at your tin. There's still more. You consider saving it, but remember how Private Thompson tried that once, and the ants built a small city in his pack. So you finish it off with the determination of a man who's eaten worse. Remember the powdered eggs? You do. Too vividly. Later, when you return home, you'll joke about Spam, maybe even refuse to eat it for a decade. But in the thick of it, during rainy mornings, sleepless nights, and long marches, it was a lifeline. A salt-brined, gelatin-topped, aluminum-sealed piece of survival. You may not love Spam, but you'll always remember it. The truck pulls up in a coughing cloud of diesel and mud. It's an old field kitchen on wheels, what the brass call a mobile mess unit, and what you call salvation. You can smell it before you see it. Something vaguely stewed, something possibly burnt, and something so aggressively garlicky it might double as pest control. You grab your mess tin and shuffle toward it like a man approaching the altar. Welcome to the miracle and misery of mobile meals. Feeding an army in motion was a logistical dance bordering on the absurd. Field kitchens were designed to follow the troops, set up quickly, and crank out hundreds of meals with minimal ingredients, questionable utensils, and only slightly more hygiene than a gas station toilet. And yet they were often the only chance you had to eat something warm. Something that didn't come from a can or make a crunching sound when it shouldn't. The American M1937 field range was one such miracle of military engineering. It had burners, ovens, even a rudimentary frying surface. When stationary, cooks could use it to boil stews, bake biscuits, or reheat industrial quantities of mystery meat. It was to gourmet cooking what a tank is to ballet. But it got the job done. Unless it ran out of fuel, or wood, or water, or hope. You line up with the others, steaming breath mingling in the cold morning. There's a strange camaraderie in this shuffle. Everyone equal before the ladle. A grizzled cook with arms like tree trunks slops something thick and grayish into your tin. Stew, he mutters. You don't ask questions. You poke it with your fork. It pushes back. For all their faults, these field kitchens were vital. They offered not just nourishment, but a sliver of routine. Soldiers could come to rely on hot meals after long marches or firefights. The U.S. Army even tried to rotate in fresh bread and baked goods. Imagine your surprise when one day you bite into something vaguely resembling a cinnamon roll. Sure, it's dry and could double as insulation, but it's sweet and warm. You nearly propose marriage. Other countries had their own mobile setups. The British Cooker No. 1 Mobile was a bulky contraption that resembled a steam-powered lawnmower. It could prepare meals for hundreds of troops, although prepare was often a generous term. If it wasn't stew, it was soup. If it wasn't soup, it was a thick paste of some kind. British humor kept things palatable, just barely. One squatty called the stew boiled boot with onion surprise. The surprise being, of course, that there was no onion. Meanwhile, German field kitchens called Gulasch Kanonen, or goulash cannons, were legendary. Sleek, efficient, and almost over-engineered, they could cook up sausages, lentils, and, yes, actual goulash. German troops often ate better than their Allied counterparts, early in the war at least. By 1944, supply lines were a mess, ingredients were scarce, and goulash turned into a vague, meat-water situation no one wanted to define. One weird but true tidbit? French field kitchens often had wine rations. You heard that right. French troops were allocated a daily wine allowance, sometimes up to half a liter. While this was typically table wine barely distinguishable from vinegar, it was a point of pride and morale. You watch a French soldier swirl it in his tin cup, sniff dramatically, and proclaim it acceptable. You nod, deeply impressed, while chewing something that might be turnip. Might. Back in the American lines, cooks had to improvise constantly. Missing salt? Use ketchup? Out of flour? Grind crackers? Need to feed 100 men with 6 potatoes? Welcome to the magic of Army mash. Half real potato, half dried flakes, half regret. Yes, that's too many halves. That's war math. Historians still debate whether these mobile meals improved combat performance. On one hand, hot food boosts morale and keeps bodies functioning. On the other, eating undercooked beans during a bombardment can produce tactical disadvantages. Gas masks were not designed for that kind of gas. You slurp the stew. It's not great. The meat is chewy. The vegetables are theoretical. But it's warm, and that counts for something. Someone next to you swears there's a bit of real beef in theirs. You stare into your bowl, willing it to reveal similar treasure. A carrot chunk floats by like a shipwreck survivor. Close enough. Then, as if summoned by sarcasm, dessert appears, a square of army cake, a dense, brick-like concoction with raisins if you're lucky. You nibble. It tastes like childhood, if your childhood involved chewing chalk in a broom closet. But you don't care. It's sweet. It's dessert. It's dignity, squared. Later, as the sky darkens and the cook truck rattles off into the mud, you huddle by a fire with a mess tin on your knees. You think about how this meal, as sad as it seemed, was the highlight of the day. How sharing gruel under the stars beats eating canned beans alone. How, when it's all said and done, it's not just about the calories. It's about feeling human. You take one last bite of whatever it was. You nod slowly. Not bad, you whisper. Someone else burps audibly. You all laugh. It's not fine dining, but it's yours. You're seated on an overturned ammo crate, chewing mechanically on a piece of bread that might actually be a disguised paving stone. Across the makeshift table, really just a board balanced on two helmets, a captured German soldier is doing the same, albeit with a faintly smug expression. He's got something on his plate that looks suspiciously like schnitzel. And you begin to wonder, did the Axis powers actually eat better? Welcome to the world's least appetizing cooking competition. Axis versus Allies. Culinary Showdown. Contrary to what some might imagine, food quality during World War II wasn't just about resources. It was about logistics, ideology, and the culinary traditions each army dragged with them to the front lines. The Allies often focused on mass production, calorie count, and supply durability. The Axis powers, especially early in the war, placed more emphasis on culturally familiar foods, even if that meant extra hassle for the quartermasters. Let's take the Germans. In the early years of the conflict, Wehrmacht troops were fed with almost Teutonic pride. Meals often included rye bread, smoked sausage, sauerkraut, and sometimes even fresh vegetables. At least before the supply lines stretched thinner than their morale. Soldiers on the Eastern Front received frozen rations that had to be thawed over makeshift fires, which sometimes led to hilariously tragic results, like charcoal carrot stew or the infamous ice cube potatoes. But still, compared to the standard American sea ration, it felt like they were dining at a cranky but competent grandmother's house. Historians still argue whether this relative comfort made the German army more disciplined or just slightly less miserable. Either way, it wasn't built to last. By 1944, the Germans were boiling shoe leather like everyone else. On the Allied side, rations were industrial to a fault. American meals emphasized calorie density and ease of transport. Flavor, optional. Enjoyment, ill-advised. But they had volume and spam, so much spam, and Hershey's D-ration chocolate bars, designed not to melt in heat and also not to taste like actual chocolate. The goal was to make it edible, but only just, so soldiers wouldn't eat it casually. Spoiler alert, they still did. Hunger wins. British soldiers, meanwhile, were given compo rations, composite packs with biscuits, tinned meat, powdered tea, and the legendary meat and vegetable stew. That stew has lived on in memory like a ghost that haunts your taste buds. Some said it contained actual vegetables. Others claimed it was a conspiracy involving wallpaper paste. Then there were the Italians, who, despite their culinary heritage, suffered from dreadful supply chains. Pasta? Rare. Olive oil? Practically mythical. Instead, they made do with dry bread, canned cheese, and bean-based soups. Not exactly Nona's kitchen. Soldiers would forage or barter with civilians to enhance meals, sometimes trading bullets for basil. Priorities. Japanese troops had perhaps the most minimalist rations of all. Rice was king, accompanied by dried fish, pickled vegetables, and the occasional plum. In tropical areas, rot and mold became common enemies. Soldiers often had to improvise, creating meals from whatever local flora and fauna they could capture. Some units resorted to eating tree bark or frogs. Quirky detail? The Japanese included small paper packets of miso soup paste. You'd add water, hopefully clean, and stir. Congratulations, you've made trench miso. Across all sides, there was a shared obsession with coffee or tea. American GIs carried packets of instant coffee that tasted like regret, mixed with battery acid. But it was hot and kept you moving. British troops, of course, carried tea with sugar cubes and powdered milk, often guarding it more closely than their rifles. Germans had ersatz coffee, while Japanese troops drank green tea. Until even that ran out. Every army had its standouts, though. The French resistance fighters often scrounged meals from local farms: bread, cheese, sometimes even wine. There are stories of fighters roasting chickens in abandoned cellars, then running for cover when the smell attracted attention. One partisan reportedly baked an apple tart using heat from a tank engine. Risky? Yes. Delicious? Absolutely. Then, of course, there's the psychological edge. Eating something that reminded you of home, even vaguely, could lift spirits in ways bullets and bandages never could. German troops with access to schnitzel or sausages would speak of eating like back in Bavaria. British Tommies clung to jam and tea. Americans fantasized about hamburgers, and Japanese soldiers sometimes carried dried plums from their mothers, salty, sour, and oddly comforting. But what about food envy on the battlefield? It happened. Soldiers would occasionally scavenge or steal enemy rations during raids just to taste what the other side had. A British soldier once traded his entire week's chocolate ration for a jar of German mustard. An American corporal reportedly broke open a German supply crate, tasted the canned sausages, and muttered, "They're losing the war, but they're winning lunch." Still, the quality gap narrowed fast as the war dragged on. Bombed-out cities, crumbling supply chains, and blockades reduced everyone's meals to the same bland denominator. By 1945, even elite units were scraping burnt rice off the bottom of mess tins and fighting over broken biscuits. You look down at your tin. Today's lunch is a scoop of meat product and some crackers that could deflect small arms fire. You glance over at the German prisoner. He's chewing slowly, eyes closed, pretending it's his mother's goulash. You both nod silently at each other. Food, for a moment, becomes the truce. Then someone belches, loudly, and the whole trench laughs. Your hands are shaking, not from fear, not even from cold, but from anticipation. From the bottom of your rucksack, buried beneath a soggy sock and a half-melted bar of chocolate, you pull out a tiny square wrapped in wax paper. It's a chocolate ration, and at this moment, it might as well be a diamond. You peel it slowly, reverently. It's slightly white at the edges, a victim of heat and time. But still, it's chocolate. Kind of. Comfort items like these were the unsung lifelines of World War II. Tiny pleasures in brown paper packages that reminded you, if only for a minute, that you were human. While the main meals were about fuel and function, These small tokens, chocolates, cigarettes, chewing gum, were all about morale. Sweet little lies that said, "You're doing okay," even when you definitely weren't. American troops were issued the famous Hershey's D-ration bars. Designed to be heat-resistant and dense, they were packed with calories, but deliberately made to be unappealing. A psychological trick. You wouldn't snack unless you absolutely had to. They were gritty, bitter, and often described as tasting like compressed sand with a cocoa afterthought. Yet, when you hadn't eaten in 12 hours and your boots were soaked in trench water, they might as well have been fine Swiss truffles. Then there was the tropical bar, Hershey's attempt to improve upon the D-ration. It resisted melting better, which was great, but unfortunately, it also resisted chewing. Soldiers joked it doubled as a self-defense weapon. One GI reportedly used it to hammer a nail, successfully. Cigarettes were another major comfort, tucked into rations like a casual vice. Camel, Lucky Strike, Chesterfield, brands that became almost mythological in status. You'd see troops pass a single cigarette down the line like a peace offering. After combat, lighting up became a ritual. Even non-smokers would take a drag just to feel like they belonged, or just to taste something besides gunpowder and canned beans. British soldiers were similarly dependent on their fags, a term that caused no small amount of confusion when Americans visited. The average Tommy received a daily ration of cigarettes, often more prized than the actual food. Tea and tobacco, sometimes together, sometimes one after the other, became the bookends of every day. And gum. Oh, the gum. American rations came with Wrigley's, usually juicy fruit or spearmint. Chewing became more than just a way to freshen breath. It distracted from hunger. It kept jaws busy. It even helped with nerves. Plus, it made great trade material. Want to swap your canned cheese for a stick of gum? Done. Want intel from a kid in a bombed-out village? Toss 'em too. Suddenly, you're the tooth fairy of foreign policy. Historians still debate whether these comforts had measurable impact on soldier effectiveness. Did chocolate really improve morale? Did a post-battle cigarette actually calm nerves, or just feed addiction? What we do know: troops guarded their comfort items with a kind of possessive reverence. More than once, a soldier risked a court-martial over hoarding or stealing someone's last piece of candy. Quirky fact: American Red Cross clubs distributed care packages that included these goodies, alongside socks, soap, and books. For prisoners of war, receiving a package with cigarettes and chocolate was more than a blessing. It was a declaration. You have not been forgotten. Some POWs would divide a chocolate square into crumbs, savoring each bite as if it were communion. Of course, not every treat was universally loved. British troops received tins of boiled sweets, essentially hard candy. These were great unless you had dental issues, which, given the era and the war, was roughly everyone. A cracked molar mid-march was not ideal. One soldier compared the sweets to sucking marbles made of sugar and disappointment. German rations also included chocolate, often high in cocoa, dark, and sometimes laced with caffeine. Soldiers used it as a stimulant during long marches or cold nights. The Wehrmacht also issued a high-energy Coca-Cola known as Air Force chocolate. It was delicious and effective, though possibly the reason so many Luftwaffe pilots looked like they hadn't blinked in days. Even Japanese troops had their version: hard candy made from rice syrup and preserved fruit slices. They also carried green tea powder and occasionally alcohol. Sake rations weren't common, but in moments of victory or despair, it might appear. One story tells of a Japanese sergeant drinking sake before charging into battle, yelling, "For the Emperor and fermented rice." Then there were the improvised comforts. A soldier brewing ersatz coffee in a tin cup over a fire. A British corporal making bread pudding from biscuit crumbs and dried fruit. An American medic creating a chocolate mousse by mixing powdered milk, cocoa, and sheer optimism. None of it would win a cooking show, but it brought a few moments of warmth to an otherwise cold world. You finish your chocolate square. It sticks to your teeth like tar, but it leaves a trace of sweetness. Across the trench, someone lights a cigarette. The smoke curls lazily in the air, joining the fog of morning. No one speaks. You all just sit. For once, not moving, not marching, just existing. Because in a war, sometimes survival isn't about firepower or tactics. Sometimes it's about the comfort of chocolate in your mouth, smoke in your lungs, and 5 minutes of peace where the world doesn't end. You're leaning against a tree stump that's more splinter than structure, holding a biscuit in one hand and a can of something ominously labeled meat not otherwise specified in the other. The sun is setting in a war-torn sky, and dinner is, how do we say this gently, limited. But you're a soldier now. You adapt. You improvise. You become a battlefield chef. Welcome to the world of soldier food hacks, culinary MacGyvering at its grittiest. If necessity is the mother of invention, then hunger's the cranky uncle who tells you to shove a cracker into a can of beans and call it gourmet. Rations weren't just eaten. They were manipulated, negotiated, and Frankensteined into creations that would make your drill sergeant weep with confused pride. Let's start with trench pudding. Popular among Allied troops, this delightful monstrosity involved crumbling hardtack biscuits, mixing them with jam or cocoa powder, if you had it, and stirring in just enough water to make a paste. Was it good? Absolutely not. But was it Swedish? And did it fill your belly? That was enough. Then there was the bulletproof burger, a slice of Spam fried directly on a bayonet over a fire, wedged between two biscuits. Add a smear of cheese spread, and you've created something that could either sustain you or kill you slowly. Historians still argue whether this burger increased morale or just intestinal resilience. German soldiers had their own innovations. With access to tinned sausage and black bread, they created makeshift open-faced sandwiches. If they got their hands on mustard, oh joy, they'd spread it thinly to elevate a sad slice of meat into something resembling a meal. In colder climates, they'd use frozen snow as a mixing base, whipping up improvised ice cream from jam and condensed milk. Think of it as PTSD-flavored sorbet. Meanwhile, British Tommies developed a tradition of brew-ups, where they'd scavenge for twigs and boil water for tea. But why stop there? Soldiers would add powdered milk, sugar, and even chocolate crumbs to make a kind of frontline mocha. If that sounds cozy, remember they were making it in helmet-turned kettles with fingers that hadn't touched soap in 3 weeks. You reach into your pack and find a packet of lemonade powder. You're out of water. But you do have a tin of peach syrup left over from someone's rare fruit ration. What do? Obviously, you mix them. Congratulations, you've invented War Punch. It tastes like regret in summer camp. American GIs, notorious for their creativity, were also infamous for ration roulette. This involved mixing items at random, cheese spread into beans, peanut butter with crackers and meat, even instant coffee into stew to add depth. The results were mixed. One soldier claimed his combo gave him superhuman strength. Another claimed it sent him to the latrine for 3 hours. Culinary roulette indeed. There's also the tale of the GI who created combat fondue. It involved melting cheese ration over a can's lid using a Zippo lighter, then dipping stale bread into it. It required patience, precision, and a total disregard for basic safety protocols. But he called it classy, and that's what counts. Japanese troops, often low on standard rations, became experts at foraging. They'd harvest wild vegetables, roast insects, and even cultivate edible moss. Some units in Southeast Asia figured out how to ferment fruit into a kind of jungle alcohol. It was foul, it was illegal, and it was oddly popular. There's a recorded case of a corporal getting caught selling the stuff out of a hollowed-out coconut. Entrepreneurial spirit, wartime edition. Even prisoners of war got inventive. In POW camps, food was minimal, but bartering was intense. One Red Cross parcel could yield dozens of combinations. Prisoners crushed crackers, mixed them with powdered milk and jam, and called it Red Cross cake. Some even created ovens from scrap metal to bake rudimentary bread. It was a defiant act, baking dignity in a place built to crush it. Your own creation tonight? You crush a hard biscuit into your can of beans, stir in a little instant coffee, and sprinkle a single sugar cube on top. You taste it. It's terrible. And yet, not the worst thing you've eaten this week. That title still belongs to Meat Surprise from Tuesday. Quirky historical tidbit. During downtime, some units ran cooking competitions. In the North African desert, British and Australian troops once held a ration bake-off. The winner? A man who made sponge cake using egg powder, lemonade mix, and sheer determination. The prize? First pick of the next Red Cross parcel. Soldiers also invented their own brands. One GI drew a cartoon pig on his cheese spread tin and dubbed it Combat Queso. His buddy labeled a packet of raisins Nature's Bullets. Humor helped the food go down. Barely. You finish your ration-hacked masterpiece and lean back, stomach fullish, pride slightly intact. Across the fire, another soldier is scraping a burnt crust from his mess tin, muttering about innovative layering. You toast your spoons and laugh, because when everything else is out of your control, at least you get to decide how to ruin your rations. And that little illusion of choice? That's the seasoning. It starts as a gentle pinch in your belly. You ignore it at first. Maybe you're just tired. Maybe you skipped a meal. But by hour 4 of the march, it's gnawing like a small, angry animal. By nightfall, it's less a sensation and more a state of being. You're hungry, truly, deeply, bone hollow, hungry, and there's no food coming. Welcome to the dark belly of the war, the front lines of hunger and starvation. Every army planned for sustenance, but wars laugh at plans. Supply lines break. Convoys are bombed. Trains derail. Kitchens are captured. And when that happens, soldiers eat whatever they can find, or nothing at all. Hunger became an enemy as fierce as any gun. American GIs had one major advantage: logistics. The U.S. military prided itself on feeding its troops, but even their sprawling supply chains couldn't reach everywhere. During major offensives or jungle campaigns, days could pass between rations. Soldiers resorted to stretching food, splitting a tin of beans 4 ways, boiling rice so thin it became broth, or chewing on grass out of desperation. A private in the Philippines once claimed he survived 2 days on nothing but lemonade powder and raw courage. British troops were no strangers to ration failure either. In Italy, bad roads and weather turned simple deliveries into week-long adventures. One unit survived for 4 days on jam packets and tea. Another told of melting snow to boil half a ration of stew, stretching it into soup so thin it could have legally been considered water with ambitions. And then there were the Germans. By 1944, with Allied bombers crippling infrastructure, hunger hit hard. Soldiers on the Eastern Front, already battered by cold, mud, and partisan attacks, found their food trains reduced to twisted metal. Meals became rare. A slab of black bread might have to last 3 days. Sauerkraut? Gone. Sausage? A memory. One soldier wrote in his diary, "Today I boiled a shoe. Not for eating, just to soften it in case I do." Historians still argue whether hunger directly influenced combat performance. Starving soldiers are slower, colder, less accurate, but they're also desperate, sometimes frighteningly so. There are documented cases of troops raiding civilian farms not for intelligence, but for chickens. In one infamous moment, a group of exhausted German soldiers stole potatoes from a French graveyard garden and ate them raw. Japanese soldiers, especially during the later Pacific campaigns, faced starvation on an apocalyptic scale. Cut off from resupply, entire island garrisons resorted to eating tropical plants, seaweed, insects, and anything that moved. One Marine discovered a Japanese outpost where rats were being bred, intentionally, not as pets. And then there's the Soviet Red Army, whose rations were often minimal even in the best conditions. Bread made from sawdust filler, soup that was just cabbage water, and meat so rare it was measured in rumors. In the siege of Leningrad, civilians ate wallpaper paste and shoe leather. Soldiers fared only slightly better. It's said that one cook stretched a single potato across 5 meals by slicing it thinly and adding dirt for texture. You sit in your foxhole, stomach clenching. Your last meal was a tin of beans 2 nights ago. You open your pack again, hoping something edible has materialized. It hasn't. You find a sugar packet, half torn. You lick it clean. It's both pathetic and perfect. Quirky story. During the North Africa campaign, a British unit trapped without food began boiling their shaving soap. Apparently, with enough pepper, it was almost tolerable. Another group roasted grasshoppers, naming them after British generals. Montgomery, by all accounts, was crunchy. And it wasn't just soldiers. Pilots stranded behind enemy lines ate insects. POWs relied on thin soups, bread heels, and whatever could be smuggled in. One airman wrote that he lived on toothpaste and hope for 3 days before rescue. Hope, tragically, is not high in calories. Starvation also had a strange effect on perception. Food dreams became common. Entire conversations were built around recipes, imagined feasts, or the perfect breakfast. Soldiers would list the meals they'd eat if they survived: pancakes with butter, roast beef, fresh bread, real eggs. These food fantasies, known among troops as gut mirages, were both a coping mechanism and a cruel torment. You once heard a tale from an old vet. He described a moment in Italy crouched beside a creek, eating raw snails with a fork carved from scrap metal. "They were disgusting," he said, "but I cried anyway, because I wasn't dying anymore." In those moments, hunger stripped you down to basics. Pride vanished. Etiquette dissolved. Food became not just survival, but salvation. A hard biscuit could feel like a miracle. A hot cup of tea, the return of civilization. Now, in your trench, the sky overhead is bruised purple. You sip boiled water and chew on the leather tie from your boot. Not to eat it, just to. You're staring at your mess tin like it holds ancient secrets. Inside is something brownish, vaguely mushy, and faintly sweet-smelling. It's not quite meat, not quite vegetable. You poke it with a spoon. It jiggles. You sigh. War cooking, you mutter. A festival of substitutes and sheer culinary audacity. Welcome to the improvisational theater of weird substitutes and wartime recipes. As supply lines crumbled and global food sources shrank under the weight of conflict, soldiers and civilians alike were introduced to a strange new culinary world, one where creativity was currency, and the phrase, "you are what you eat," became an ominous threat. Let's begin with coffee. Real coffee was precious and perishable. Enter its awkward understudy, roasted chicory root. In American mess halls, powdered substitutes known as postum were stirred into mugs with military indifference. It smelled kind of like coffee and tasted kind of like boiled shoes. Soldiers joked it made your tongue file for leave. The Germans leaned hard into ersatz everything. Ersatz butter made from rendered animal fats and mashed peas. Ersatz eggs whipped up from soy flour and water. Ersatz jam. That was charitably a sweetened beet paste. The word ersatz became a grim joke. If it didn't taste like sadness, it wasn't authentic. British troops faced their own flavor famine. Butter was replaced with margarine compound, a spreadable paste so unappetizing it came with instructions on how to make it look yellow. Soldiers added beet juice or carrot powder to trick the eye, but not the tongue. Meanwhile, milk was reimagined as powdered flakes, dry, chalky, and vaguely barn-scented. A sip would take you straight back to cow-related trauma you didn't know you had. And meat? When rations ran thin, substitutions stepped in with tragic enthusiasm. American meatloaf in the field might contain as little as 40% actual meat. The rest? Bread filler, soy, and seasoning so aggressive it demanded a written apology. Still, it held together in the can, and that was something. In the Soviet Union, recipes became acts of resistance. Housewives created victory cutlets from grated carrots and stale bread. Cakes were made with mashed potatoes. Tea was steeped from apple peels and burnt crusts. One popular dish was cabbage surprise, the surprise being whether it had any cabbage. You take a bite of your own ration, a cheese substitute spread with an alarming texture, something between rubber cement and betrayal. You pair it with a cracker made from compressed flour and silence. Together, they form a duet of disappointment. But soldiers didn't just suffer these substitutes. They remixed them. British troops, tired of the same biscuits, crushed them into crumbs, added water and jam, and steamed the mixture into a kind of sweat pudding. Not delicious, but dense and oddly satisfying. German troops experimented with fried sauerkraut cakes. American GIs mixed powdered lemonade with snow for war sorbet. Sometimes the recipes were born of madness, sometimes genius, occasionally both. One quirky but true story. A group of Allied engineers in the North African desert figured out how to bake flatbread using engine heat from tanks. They wrapped dough around the mufflers, let it crisp while driving, and proudly called it exhaust loaf. The taste? Somewhere between naan and napalm. Another unit in Italy discovered that peanut butter rations mixed with mashed beans could mimic pâté. Battlefield hummus, they called it, served with biscuits, and low expectations. Back on the home front, wartime cookbooks flourished. Britain's Ministry of Food released guides like Cooking in Wartime and Make Do and Mend, encouraging civilians to substitute meat with lentils, sugar with carrots, and eggs with vinegar baking soda combos. The results varied. The optimism did not. Historians still argue whether these substitute recipes helped morale or simply masked despair in pie crusts. But one thing is clear. They stretched food, staved off starvation, and gave people something to do besides panic. Japanese troops, with limited imports and tropical terrain, relied heavily on fermented foods and foraged substitutes. Soybeans became a lifeline. They were ground into flour, brewed into sauces, and pressed into tofu-like bricks that were chewable, if not lovable. Troops on isolated islands often boiled wild roots, roasted coconut shavings, and even experimented with lizards. Yes, lizards. Crunchy, but with notes of war guilt. You take another bite. The substitute cheese clings to your spoon like a stage 5 clinger. You wash it down with warm, rehydrated fruit beverage that tastes like orange's distant cousin who was raised in a chemical plant. And then, a miracle. Someone tosses you a packet of mustard. Real mustard. You tear it open and smear it across the biscuit. It's tangy. It's sharp. It tastes like civilization. For one glorious moment, you forget you're eating a casserole made from war crumbs and emotional trauma. The thing is, these weird recipes became culture. Troops traded them, refined them, passed them down. Some even made it home. Spam hash, powdered egg omelets, and fake coffee survived into the post-war years. Not as luxuries, but as nostalgic echoes. A reminder of when food didn't have to be good, just good enough. You scrape the last of the spread from your tin, lean back, and burp softly. Not from satisfaction, but from survival. Because sometimes the greatest act of resistance is making soup out of nothing and still finding a way to share it. The snow is falling softly now, muting the war to a kind of hush. Around you, soldiers shuffle in the half-light, their breath rising in visible wisps, their faces red from cold and something more subtle. Homesickness. You clutch a small tin of turkey and stare at it like it might teleport you home. It doesn't. But for a moment, it feels close. This is Christmas, or Hanukkah, or whatever version of holiday the war will allow. Holiday meals at war were a strange blend of improvisation, nostalgia, and, if you were lucky, a can of something slightly better than usual. They weren't feasts. They were gestures, tiny attempts at normalcy in a world that had stopped pretending to be normal. In December of 1944, American troops in the Ardennes were surrounded, cold and hungry. But mess officers still tried to deliver a holiday dinner. Some soldiers received a tin labeled roast turkey dinner with gravy. Others got ham and sweet potatoes. One unit in Belgium claimed they ate fruit cocktail for the first time since basic training. Tasted like dessert and memory, one corporal wrote. The British Army went hard on tradition. On Christmas Day, no matter where they were, officers served the enlisted men. This odd reversal of rank came with tinned beef, carrots, and a chunk of figgy pudding so dense it may have required field surgery to cut. In the North African desert, one cook roasted a camel. Not part of the plan, but reportedly delicious. German soldiers celebrated Weihnachten with what they called Festessen, a festive meal that could include sausages, sauerkraut, and perhaps a shot of schnapps. In the early years of the war, units tried to replicate familiar holiday meals. Later, those turned into symbolic gatherings with more music than meat. A German officer in Stalingrad once carved a loaf of bread like it was a goose. His men clapped anyway. Japanese soldiers, without the same Western holiday calendar, still marked the new year with special food when possible. Mochi rice cakes, pickled vegetables, and sweet beans were traditional, though rarely available. One unit improvised by steaming rice with jam and calling it sweet harmony. Morale boost? Possibly. Gastronomic risk? Absolutely. Historians still argue whether these symbolic meals truly mattered. Nutritionally, they were rarely impressive. Logistically, they were often a nightmare. But emotionally, they were everything. In the middle of nowhere, halfway around the world with bombs falling and bullets flying, the idea that someone thought you deserved turkey, it meant something. You remember one soldier's story from Italy. The mess crew built a makeshift oven using bricks from a collapsed villa. They roasted chickens scavenged from nearby fields and peeled potatoes by hand. They even fashioned a cake from crushed biscuits and condensed milk. It collapsed into mush, but it was served with such pride that no one cared. One man wept while eating it, not because it tasted good, but because it reminded him of his mother. Quirky holiday rations were also a thing. The U.S. Army once issued special Christmas kits: cigarettes, candy, canned fruit, and chocolate bars with green wrappers. British troops might get a small box of nuts and raisins labeled festive mix, which was only festive if you'd never tasted real chocolate. Some Canadian soldiers received small gifts from home, smuggled into rucksacks by chaplains. One got a maple syrup tin. He drank it straight and declared himself immortal. In POW camps, the holidays were bittersweet. Red Cross parcels might include extras: cocoa powder, pudding mix, maybe even a tin of fish. Prisoners would hoard these for weeks, then throw miniature feasts. They decorated with scraps of fabric, hummed carols, and made toast with lukewarm tea. One prisoner drew a Christmas tree on the wall with chalk and labeled each branch with the name of someone he missed. By Boxing Day, it was filled. You shift the tin in your hand. The turkey is, okay, a little dry. The gravy tastes mostly of salt and aluminum, but someone found cranberries. Canned, sure, but tart and sweet and entirely unexpected. You pass a slice to the guy next to you. He tears up. You pretend not to notice. Later that night, someone plays a harmonica. Another hums along. A third guy, who claims he once sang in a church choir, croaks out a verse of Silent Night. It's off-key and shaky, but somehow perfect. Because in war, holidays aren't about food. They're about the idea of home, of peace, of something beyond the mud, the cold, and the ever-present ache in your gut. You take a final bite. You close your eyes. You let the moment stretch. It's not much, but it's yours. You duck into the mess tent with your shoulders hunched and expectations low. The line is already long, snaking past crates labeled non-specific protein and beans, probably. The smell hits you, something meaty, something burnt, and something suspiciously fishy. You sigh and move forward. It's mess hall time, and you've learned to approach it like gambling with fewer winners and more gray sauce. Mess halls, or field dining facilities, were the social arenas of war. Equal parts cafeteria, comedy club, and psychological experiment. They were where soldiers gathered not just to eat, but to decompress, to complain, to laugh, and yes, occasionally, to contemplate desertion based on the contents of their plate. The setup was simple: long tables, clattering trays, and servers with 1,000-yard stares. The menu? Variable. On a good day, beef stew, mashed potatoes, maybe a slab of cake with icing that tasted faintly of soap. On a bad day, mystery loaf, a beige rectangle that defied taxonomy. Was it meat? Was it bread? Was it insulation from a downed aircraft? Historians still argue. The U.S. Army mess was known for its sheer volume. Feeding hundreds, even thousands of troops required assembly line efficiency. Cooks rose at 4 a.m., lit fires, cracked cans, boiled vats. Everything came in industrial quantities. Eggs, powdered, milk, evaporated, butter, hilariously absent. Still, the food came hot, if not always edible. One soldier likened his breakfast to warm regret on a tray. British mess halls ran on tradition and tea. Always tea. Even if the food ran out, tea remained. A typical lunch: tinned meat, boiled vegetables, bread that could double as sandbags. Dessert, if you could call it that, was often spotted dick, a steamed pudding with raisins. You could chew it, or throw it. Both had tactical value. Quirky mess hall moment? In Italy, an Allied unit built a makeshift pizza oven using tank armor. The result? Flatbread topped with tinned tomatoes and sausage. They called it kimbazza. It was terrible. They loved it anyway. German mess halls, at least early in the war, prided themselves on order. Meals included soup, sausage, and rye bread. Officers had slightly better fare, veal, fresh vegetables, but by 1944, everyone was chewing on boiled barley and memories. One German soldier joked that the only spice left was despair. Then there was mess etiquette, or lack thereof. Food fights happened, not the dramatic Hollywood kind, but passive-aggressive skirmishes. A spoon flicked here, a crust lobbed there. The mess hall was where hierarchy blurred. A colonel might sit next to a private, both united in disgust over the meatloaf. Cooks held strange power. Respected and feared, they controlled access to extras. Seconds of beans, a slice of cake, the good part of the stew. Befriend the cook, and you might survive the week with morale intact. Cross them, and enjoy your extra helping of tongue loaf. Yes, that was real. Yes, it was as horrifying as it sounds. You slide your tray forward. Today's entree? Chipped beef on toast, affectionately known as SOS, or stuff on a shingle. It's salty, creamy, and weirdly comforting, if only because you can recognize it. Next to it, overcooked peas and a roll that squeaks when torn. Dessert? Gelatin square, lime green, possibly sentient. You sit down with your buddies. Conversation flows. Someone rates the food, 4 out of 10, with bonus points for temperature. Another shares a rumor. Real chicken is coming next week. Someone else scoffs. Real chicken died in 1939, he says. You all laugh. Despite the grumbling, mess halls served a purpose. They kept people fed, sure, but they also anchored routine. They were places of community, no matter how terrible the tuna casserole. Soldiers traded stories, shared news, and sometimes just sat in silence, grateful for warmth and calories. POWs had messes too, Spartan ones. In better camps, they received Red Cross parcels with powdered milk, margarine, and chocolate. Meals were often basic: soup, bread, maybe a slice of meat. But prisoners made the most of it, organizing mess schedules, dividing ingredients, even hosting theme nights. One British POW camp reportedly held a mock gala dinner, complete with menus written in cursive and imaginary wine lists. It wasn't food, it was defiance. Homefront mess halls, like those in training camps or naval bases, were often the birthplace of culinary experiments. Navy cooks created tuna chowder with creamed corn. Army chefs tried to make spaghetti using ketchup. The results were controversial, but troops ate them because complaining burned calories. You finish your meal. The toast is soggy, the beef is mysterious, and the gelatin wobbles ominously. Still, your stomach is foolish. You trade a spoonful of peas for an extra roll. Someone hums a tune. Another slaps the table in rhythm. The mess hall becomes a moment of absurd peace. Because in a world where nothing is certain, at least you can count on this. Dinner will be weird, probably overcooked, maybe green, but it will arrive, and you will eat it. Together. You sit cross-legged on the dirt, holding a tin cup in both hands. It's warm, which already makes it better than yesterday. Inside is soup, thin, bland, but soup nonetheless. You sip slowly, savoring it like it's fine cuisine. Around you, dozens of others do the same, heads down, voices quiet. This isn't the front. This is a prison camp. And tonight, you're one of the lucky ones. Meals for prisoners of war were a dicey affair, balanced precariously between protocol, pity, and the unpredictable chaos of war. The Geneva Conventions technically required captors to feed POWs reasonably well, but reasonable varied wildly depending on the camp, the captors, and how the war was going. Often, meals were basic, monotonous, or missing entirely. Hunger was constant. Hope came in tins with Red Cross labels. In German-run POW camps, British and American prisoners were often given thin soups, usually cabbage or barley, paired with dark bread. Sometimes a boiled potato or scrap of meat found its way into the pot, but more often, it didn't. One RAF airman described his meals as water warmed with vegetable breath. He wasn't far off. Enter the Red Cross parcel, the gold standard of wartime care. Sent regularly, when allowed, these packages were lifelines. Each contained staples like powdered milk, canned meat, cheese, chocolate, jam, biscuits, and cigarettes. Soldiers shared, traded, and guarded them fiercely. Some items were eaten instantly. Others were hoarded for birthdays or bartering. A tin of sardines might fetch you a pair of socks. A bar of chocolate? Priceless. In fact, POW economies often revolved around these parcels. Currency was measured in cocoa and spam. Gambling games sprang up, with the winners claiming cheese tins or raisins. Soldiers wrote letters home, not asking for news, but for extra cocoa if possible. One camp reportedly held cooking contests using only Red Cross ingredients. The winning dish? Spam mousse with biscuit crust. The judges didn't survive. Just kidding. Mostly. American prisoners in Japanese camps weren't as fortunate. Many received no Red Cross parcels at all. Meals were often rice-based with occasional vegetables. Protein was scarce. Hunger was constant. Malnutrition, a daily battle. Survivors speak of sharing a single egg among 10 men, or catching frogs in puddles just to taste meat. One prisoner remembered making soup from boiled tree bark. It wasn't good, he said, but it felt like doing something. Quirky moment. In a German camp for Allied officers, a group once recreated a French bistro using cardboard signs and menus. Dressed in makeshift uniforms, they served their soup and bread with flair, describing it as vichyssoise de la camp. Laughter filled the hall. The soup was still terrible, but morale soared. POW camps also bore culinary dreams. Men would lie awake, not thinking of escape, but of food. Roast chicken, apple pie, eggs that weren't powdered. Whole conversations orbited fantasy menus. These weren't just idle thoughts. They were survival tools. Imagination fed the spirit when the stomach failed. Historians still argue about the long-term health effects of POW diets. Many former prisoners left camps with permanent damage, digestive issues, vitamin deficiencies, missing teeth. Some never regained their full strength. Others carried emotional scars tied to hunger more than violence. A man who once shared his last biscuit with a friend would later break down crying in a grocery store aisle, overwhelmed by choice. Women POWs, especially nurses captured in the Pacific, faced similar struggles. They too rationed meals, invented recipes, and created support networks built around shared meals, no matter how small. One nurse described their Christmas feast as a spoonful of rice and a prayer. "We didn't eat much," she wrote, "but we ate together." Back in Europe, some POWs grew gardens. In camps with slightly better conditions, prisoners planted potatoes, carrots, even herbs. It gave them purpose and better soup. One group made beer from fermented raisins and crusts. Another fashioned a still from scrap metal. The result was potent, terrible, and immediately confiscated. Then there were the letters. Families back home sent recipes instead of food, knowing parcels might not arrive. A soldier would sit in a bunk, reading instructions for mom's cornbread, eyes closed, imagining each step. He'd describe it to others. They'd argue about the best way to mix batter, even without a pan. It was all fantasy, but it helped. You take another sip of your soup. It's watery, yes, but warm. And today, the bread came with a smear of something buttery, maybe margarine, maybe a miracle. You split it with the guy next to you, no words exchanged. Because here in the camp, food is never just food. It's proof you're alive. It's proof someone, somewhere, remembers. And sometimes, it tastes like hope. You stand in the kitchen, apron smeared with flour and frustration, staring at a tin of powdered milk like it owes you an apology. Outside, bombs echo in the distance. Inside, your children are hungry, the rations are dwindling, and dinner depends on a recipe clipped from a government leaflet. Welcome to the front lines behind the front lines, the wartime kitchen. While soldiers fought with rifles and tanks, women, especially on the Allied home fronts, fought with spoons and ration books. Their battle was daily, domestic, and no less heroic. With sugar, butter, and meat strictly limited, they improvised meals with substitute ingredients, creative techniques, and sheer culinary nerve. In Britain, rationing began in 1940 and lasted nearly a decade. A typical adult weekly allowance: 4 ounces of bacon, 2 ounces of butter, 1 egg, and a heap of patience. Housewives were encouraged to stretch meals, avoid waste, and embrace novelty items like dried eggs and Woolton pie, a vegetable casserole named after Lord Woolton, the Minister of Food. It was nutritious. It was economical. It was beige. The Ministry of Food became a national institution. They published cookbooks, hosted radio shows, and even created characters like Dr. Carrot and Potato Pete to cheerfully nudge citizens toward healthy, low-meat meals. One quirky detail: Dr. Carrot was illustrated with a monocle. Nothing says, "Trust me," like an optometrist vegetable. Across the Atlantic, American women dealt with different shortages: coffee, sugar, canned goods. But the pressure was just as intense. Victory gardens sprouted in backyards. Women canned produce, traded recipes, and attended cooking classes to learn how to make meatless meatloaf and war cake, a dessert made without eggs, milk, or butter. One housewife reportedly made a pie crust from mashed turnips. Her family never forgave her. Historians still argue whether these wartime diets improved public health. Sugar consumption dropped, vegetables increased, and processed food took a back seat to home cooking. But psychologically, the toll was heavy. Mothers stretched meals like elastic bands. Every spoonful mattered. Every scrap was reused. Bacon fat was saved in jars. For cooking, yes, but also for making explosives. Welcome to multitasking, 1940s style. Children felt it too. School lunches were sparse. Candies became rare. One child in London received an orange for Christmas and carried it around like a trophy for 2 days before eating it. Another saved his chocolate ration for 6 weeks to make a birthday cake, then fainted from excitement after the first bite. German households were under even more pressure. Bombing raids, blockades, and dwindling farmland made food scarcity critical. Ersatz products filled shelves: artificial honey, fake coffee, synthetic sausages. Housewives ground acorns for flour and boiled nettles for soup. A popular dish was bread soup, which, to be clear, was made from old bread water and a prayer. One Berlin mother reportedly cried when her daughter asked what peas looked like. In the Soviet Union, the Homefront was brutal. Urban kitchens operated under siege. Families grew potatoes in window boxes, boiled shoe leather for broth, and made soup from dried leaves. In Leningrad, during the infamous blockade, entire neighborhoods survived on 125 grams of bread per day. That bread, half sawdust, half desperation. Japanese women facing severe rationing and American bombing turned to rice, seaweed, and root vegetables. Soybeans were the miracle food: mashed, fermented, fried. Recipes emphasized simplicity and seasonality, though not by choice. One mother recorded a recipe for fake egg using mashed tofu, turmeric, and vinegar. Her children hated it. She made it anyway, every week. And yet, through it all, these kitchens stayed alive. Women bartered, baked, experimented. They shared what little they had. They turned sugar beets into syrup, carrots into marmalade, and lentils into legends. One British woman became famous on her street for making mock sausage rolls using mashed parsnips and oats. Her neighbor accused her of witchcraft. Even Hollywood joined the effort. Actresses like Carole Lombard and Bette Davis appeared in PSAs, urging women to conserve food. Cookbooks were printed with titles like Feeding Your Man in Uniform and More with Less. The irony? Most of those actresses had private chefs. You wipe your hands on your apron and check the oven. Inside is a meatloaf made from oats, grated onion, and just enough beef to fool your tongue. It smells promising. You slice it carefully, dividing it among your children like gold. They eat in silence. One asks if there's dessert. You smile and pass him an apple. Because in this war, victory isn't just won in trenches. It's baked, boiled, and served one humble meal at a time. You step off the transport, boots hitting familiar pavement for the first time in what feels like a lifetime. The war is over. Your duffel bag is heavy with gear, but your thoughts are heavier with hunger, for normal food, for fresh ingredients, for something that isn't gray and gelatinous. But the strangest thing, you're also craving Spam. Welcome to the culinary legacy of war, a strange, salty aftermath that followed veterans home and reshaped kitchens for decades. World War II didn't just change borders and politics, it changed dinner. Soldiers returned home with habits, tastes, and tolerances forged in field kitchens and foxholes. Some foods they'd never touch again. Others became comfort food, even nostalgia. It was as if war had written itself into their palates. Let's start with Spam. Once a punchline, always a presence. Hormel's miracle meat followed veterans into peacetime. It showed up in fried breakfasts, casseroles, sandwiches, and, somewhat tragically, in potlucks. Entire cookbooks were published featuring Spam recipes. Spam and Egg Supreme, Spam Balaya, Spam Wellington. Historians still argue whether this was patriotism or culinary Stockholm syndrome. American supermarkets capitalized on wartime food familiarity. Powdered milk, canned stew, boxed mixes, all those shelf-stable innovations developed during the war now became domestic staples. Betty Crocker's wartime guides evolved into post-war home convenience Bibles. Suddenly, dinner could be made in 15 minutes and taste like your mess kit days, but with more parsley. Britain took a slightly more suspicious approach. After years of rationing, which continued until 1954, citizens were both grateful and cautious. Processed food remained common, but fresh meat, sugar, and butter were embraced with near-religious fervor. The return of real bananas caused public tears. One child reportedly licked a peeled one for 10 minutes before eating it, just in case it vanished. And then there were the psychological effects. Veterans carried food trauma, food rituals, food jokes. Some refused to eat stew ever again. Others hoarded tins, just in case. One GI kept a can of peaches on his mantle for years. Never opened it. Just looked at it like a memory preserved in syrup. Quirky example. In post-war Germany, a former Luftwaffe pilot opened a restaurant featuring field cuisine. Patrons sat on benches, ate sausage from mess tins, and drank ersatz coffee. It was weirdly popular. Nostalgia is a strange seasoning. In Japan, wartime rice scarcity gave way to a boom in Western-inspired cuisine. American rations, especially canned meat and bread, influenced dishes like Spam musubi and Neapolitan spaghetti, ketchup-based pasta. Soldiers who once hated American food now recreated it for their children, with improvements, of course, and real tomatoes. Even in the Soviet bloc, Post-war cookbooks included tips learned during the war, stretching meat with grains, making desserts with beets, fermenting everything that didn't run away. Survival became tradition. One Russian grandmother proudly taught her granddaughter how to make victory soup, a thin broth of cabbage, water, and patience. In America, the GI Bill helped millions attend college and buy homes, and fill those homes with war-era appliances, electric stoves, fridges, Tupperware. Leftovers became a thing. Lunchboxes featured bologna slices, canned pears, and thermoses of coffee strong enough to strip paint. In a way, the war created the modern American lunch. Yet, for all the convenience, many veterans quietly reverted to simplicity. A slice of bread, a fried egg, a weak cup of coffee. It wasn't gourmet, but it felt honest. One Marine described his ideal breakfast as not powdered, not rehydrated, and not requiring a bayonet to open. There were culinary callbacks, too. Soldiers told stories at dinner tables about field meals gone wrong, about soup with a side of dirt, about how one guy in their platoon made a birthday cake from powdered sugar and hope. Families laughed, kids rolled their eyes, but the stories stuck. Historians now recognize food as a key cultural artifact of World War II. It reveals not just what was available, but how people coped, adapted, and remembered. A can of corned beef isn't just meat, it's memory. A ration chocolate bar isn't just a snack, it's resilience wrapped in foil. You sit down at your own table. The plate before you is steaming, familiar. Real mashed potatoes, real gravy, maybe even roast chicken, but off to the side, a single slice of fried Spam. Just one. You smile. Because even the foods you once cursed have a place in your story. They fed you. They annoyed you. They kept you alive. And now, they remind you, not just of war, but of coming home. You lie on your back, staring at the roof of a tent, or the stars, or a ceiling that no longer leaks. Your stomach growls softly, not from real hunger. Those days are behind you mostly, but from a ghost, a phantom ache that lives where the war once lived. You close your eyes, and like so many nights before, your thoughts drift to food. Not just any food, the one meal you never got, the one you dreamed of during storms and shellfire, the hot, heavy, perfectly seasoned plate of home you imagined on endless marches and sleepless nights. You never got it. But in your mind, you built it. Every soldier had their own version. For some, it was a thick steak, charred outside, pink within, sizzling in butter. For others, it was lasagna, gooey and molten, layers of memory stacked like armor. Some just wanted eggs, fresh eggs, not powdered, not scrambled in a tin, just eggs, fried in a pan that smelled like morning. You dreamed about that food. You whispered it to yourself like a prayer. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, real gravy, bread, soft and warm, pie, peach or apple, coffee, real coffee, hot, strong, sweet. The war gave you time to imagine. Hours in foxholes, weeks in hospital cots, months on the move. And every one of those minutes was padded with food fantasies, menus scribbled in notebooks, recipes recited out loud, plans for restaurants you'd open when this all ended. Nothing fancy, you told your buddies. Just meat, bread, and good damn coffee. One guy promised he'd eat nothing but pancakes for a week. Another swore off Spam forever. Someone else said he'd buy a farm and raise chickens, just so he'd never go without eggs again. You all laughed. You believed him. Historians still argue whether these dreams were coping mechanisms or culinary madness. But they were real, and they mattered. Food was the future. It was proof there would be a future, that the war would end, and someone would sit you down and say, You've earned this before sliding a plate in front of you, heavy with all the things you missed. Hot, delicious, safe. But maybe the food wasn't the point. Maybe it was the idea of home, of normalcy, of warmth. A plate is just a plate. But when it's filled with kindness, memory, and survival, that's a banquet. You roll to your side, half asleep now, and imagine that perfect meal one more time. This time, you're not on guard duty. There's no shell fire, no spam, just the clink of silverware, the low murmur of family, the smell of gravy rising like incense. You take a bite, slow, deep, full. You are full. The lights dim further now, the war-torn kitchens and muddy trenches fading behind the softness of sleep. The clang of mess kits and the hiss of field stoves fade, replaced by a gentle hum. Maybe the fan in your room, maybe just your breath. You're safe. No rations to open, no lines to stand in. Just the quiet echo of stories told in tin cups and whispered over cold coffee. The kind of stories that live in the back of your mind, tucked beside the memory of a warm biscuit or a shared chocolate square under the stars. Let your shoulders fall. Let your jaw unclench. The soldier's march is done for now, the hunger silenced by time. In its place, a soft fullness of memory, of gratitude, of knowing you endured. Drift now. Let yourself wander, perhaps through a kitchen filled with sunlight, or a dining room buzzing with laughter. The food on the table? It doesn't matter. What matters is the comfort, the company, the peace. Let the aromas, the textures, the flavors of imagined meals carry you. Let them blend into your dreams. Let them blur the edges of the day until they soften completely. You're home. You're fed. You're safe. Now, dim the lights. End of script. Sweet dreams.